For over 2 decades, Duchess Sophie served the crown in quiet dignity, often overlooked, rarely celebrated. But now, in a sudden twist that no one saw coming, King Charles steps forward not just with words of gratitude, but with one of the monarchy's rarest honors. What changed? Why now? And what does it mean for the future of the House of Windsor? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. There had always been something different about Sophie. While others scrambled for titles, headlines, and court favor, she chose the path of unwavering service. No scandals, no public outbursts, just a slow, steady commitment to the institution that had shaped and tested so many before her. As the wife of Prince Edward, she remained steadfastly loyal, often blending into the background while the stormy spotlight shifted from one royal to the next. But within palace walls, insiders whispered a different story, one of a woman who carried burdens without ever asking for recognition, of a duchess who soothed tension behind closed doors, and of a figure who quietly held together the fraying seams of a fragile dynasty. In the years following the losses of Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II, that quiet strength became indispensable. Where others struggled to define their roles amid a shifting power dynamic, Sophie stepped in with calm assurance. From representing the crown at global engagements to personally comforting grieving members of the extended royal family, she became a bridge between tradition and transition, between memory and responsibility. And yet, despite her pivotal role, she remained overlooked in the court of public opinion. Until now. What caught royal observers off guard wasn't just the fact that King Charles honored her, it was how. The royal Victorian chain is not merely ceremonial, it is sacred, reserved for only the most distinguished and trusted individuals. Its conferral is deeply personal. It's not recommended by the government, nor by advisors, it's chosen by the sovereign alone. And in choosing Sophie, Charles sent a thunderous message that her decades of silent loyalty had not gone unnoticed. This wasn't just a royal thank you, it was a strategic elevation. And then there was Charles himself, a monarch known for calculated gestures and reserved demeanor. He broke protocol in the smallest but most telling of ways. His voice, as described by a palace aide, trembled ever so slightly as he addressed Sophie. His words for service beyond the eyes of the public, and loyalty in the quietest of storms carried weight. It was as if he wasn't simply thanking her, but acknowledging a truth long buried beneath royal formality, that without Sophie's steadiness, the royal family's internal fractures might have deepened beyond repair. The timing was no accident either. With increasing scrutiny on the monarchy's relevance and cohesion, this unexpected elevation of Sophie hinted at more than appreciation. It signaled trust. It suggested she would play a more prominent role in what some insiders are now calling the stabilization strategy, a behind-the-scenes plan to secure the monarchy's moral center. And that center, it seems, would be built on Sophie's shoulders. Whispers from Clarence House suggest this honor was not merely symbolic, but a precursor to deeper inclusion in Charles's inner circle. Her presence at key briefings has increased. Her opinion, once politely heard, is now being actively sought. And her image, previously absent from strategic communications, has subtly begun appearing alongside other senior royals. The royal machine, often slow to move, has turned its spotlight, and it has chosen Duchess Sophie. But the ceremony itself, planned in shadows and executed with unspoken urgency, told a story far more powerful than mere protocol. There was no public announcement, no elaborate fanfare, just a velvet box, a stunned duchess, and a moment that seemed to pause the entire palace. Insiders say the Royal Victorian chain was delivered not just as an award, but as a message. And that message, not everyone in the royal circle was ready to hear it. While the world remained blissfully unaware, Windsor's inner chamber prepared for something far more profound than a routine recognition. The Royal Victorian chain is rarely conferred, and when it is, it almost always happens with calculated ceremony at Buckingham Palace. But this time, that tradition was broken. In a move that puzzled even senior staffers, Charles chose to deliver the honor away from the spotlight, opting for Windsor intimate, shielded, and heavy with personal history. It wasn't simply about location, it was about intent. The king wasn't interested in spectacle. He wanted silence. He wanted control. And above all, he wanted secrecy. Those few who were allowed to witness it say the room stilled as Sophie entered, unaware of what awaited her. No official program, no ceremonial guards, just a simple room, a small circle of senior aides, and the sovereign waiting with a velvet box. The tension, though unspoken, was electric. As the king opened the box and lifted the gold insignia, the look on Sophie's face was unmistakable, genuine shock, disbelief, and a flicker of something rarely seen in royal events, emotion that refused to be hidden. She wept, not because of the grandeur of the medal, but because she had spent years wondering if her devotion had been forgotten. In that moment, Charles made sure she knew it hadn't. The words he spoke were brief but uncharacteristically personal. Those in the room later admitted they'd never heard the king speak to a non-consort in such deeply familial terms. "You've held this family when it wanted to fall," he reportedly said. "You gave without being asked. And now I must give what should have been given long ago." There was no press coverage, no palace broadcast, no immediate statement, only a controlled leak days later, giving the world a sanitized version. But within those stone walls, it was clear. Something had shifted. And yet, even as Charles extended this extraordinary gesture, notable absences whispered louder than the honor itself. The Queen's companions, Camilla's hand-selected inner court, were nowhere to be seen. Their absence sparked immediate speculation. Was this ceremony intentionally closed to them? Was Charles drawing a line between the two most influential women in his orbit? And if so, was he signaling a recalibration of the court's inner power dynamics? Royal watchers now believe the timing was anything but coincidental. With tensions rising behind the scenes, strained alliances, fading loyalties, and silent realignments. This honor became more than a thank you. It became a declaration. By bestowing the royal Victorian chain at such a delicate time, Charles wasn't just honoring Sophie. He was elevating her, placing her above the noise, shielding her from what was to come. And what was to come, palace insiders insist, had been building for years, buried in old photographs, unseen gestures, and quiet acts of courage. Because yet behind the solemn beauty of the moment, something deeper was unraveling, an unspoken debt, decades in the making. Before the glamour, before the recognition, there were the years of silence. The years when Sophie carried the royal weight without acknowledgement. What were the sacrifices she made behind palace doors? And why is the truth only emerging now, when the monarchy is at its most fragile? Sophie's entrance into the royal family was not met with celebration. Whispers of her background, doubts about her readiness, and unfounded comparisons to Diana cast an early shadow over her place at court. The press pounced on missteps, ignoring the quiet dignity with which she conducted herself. From the outset, she was seen as secondary, a peripheral figure in a family that clung tightly to its hierarchy. And yet, instead of pushing back, Sophie chose silence. A silence that would, over the years, speak louder than any headline. As Queen Elizabeth's health began to decline in her later years, it wasn't always Charles or William at her side. It was Sophie, steadfast, present, and emotionally intuitive. She became an anchor for the aging monarch, attending private lunches, accompanying her on low-profile visits, and offering a presence that was not performative, but deeply personal. Palace insiders have long known that during the Queen's most vulnerable moments, it was Sophie's quiet support that brought her the most peace. And yet, these acts of devotion remained deliberately hidden from the public, locked away in the private rituals of monarchy. But Sophie's burdens weren't confined to moments of grace. She bore the strain of maintaining royal unity through a barrage of crises: Andrew's scandals, Harry and Meghan's rupture, Philip's passing, and a cascade of internal divisions that threatened to splinter the House of Windsor. While others faltered or fled, Sophie held the line, attending event after event, never revealing the emotional toll behind her carefully composed expressions. She did not flinch. She endured, because that is what was expected, even when the cost was never acknowledged. Then there was her bond with Catherine, an alliance forged not in public but in shared understanding. At a time when Catherine faced unrelenting pressure from both the institution and the media, it was Sophie who offered a guiding hand, discreet counsel, and emotional shelter. Few know of the late-night phone calls, the handwritten notes slipped through private channels, or the fierce defense Sophie mounted when palace gossip turned cruel. She protected Catherine not just as a sister-in-law, but as someone who knew all too well what it meant to be cast aside while carrying the full weight of duty. Beyond the palace gates, Sophie travelled tirelessly across the Commonwealth, representing the crown in conflict zones, rural clinics, and forgotten corners of royal diplomacy. These engagements were rarely publicised, almost never televised. Yet time and again, her name appeared in private royal reports as reliable, emotionally intelligent, and deeply committed. Staffers called her the monarchy's quiet compass, but the public remained largely unaware until now. The king's recent honour did not arise from a vacuum. It was the culmination of decades of unspoken reverence inside the palace. For years, senior courtiers had quietly petitioned for Sophie's role to be elevated, but Charles waited perhaps for the right moment, perhaps for the world to finally be ready to see what he had long understood, that Sophie had given the monarchy not just her service but her soul. But it wasn't just service the king was rewarding. It was loyalty in the face of betrayal, and strength in moments when others fell. The royal Victorian chain may have been draped around Sophie's neck, but the tension in the room was unmistakable. Whispers swirled. Was this Charles's subtle way of drawing a line between his queen and his sister-in-law? And why has Camilla reportedly distanced herself from Sophie since that day? Long before the ceremony, the quiet but unmistakable rift between Camilla and Sophie had begun to widen. At the heart of it were two fundamentally different views of what modern royalty should be. Camilla, elevated late into the monarchy's inner sanctum, had long operated through influence, charm, and private allegiances. Sophie, on the other hand, had earned her place through relentless commitment, consistency, and humility without ever seeking headlines. Where Camilla mastered the art of royal presence, Sophie became the embodiment of royal substance. And that difference, though rarely discussed publicly, was impossible to ignore within palace corridors. Behind the closed doors of Clarence House, discussions over Commonwealth patronages had become a fault line. Camilla reportedly preferred a curated, centralized approach focusing on high-profile patronages and legacy ties to the late Queen. Sophie, however, quietly advocated for decentralizing royal attention, amplifying neglected causes in smaller nations, and empowering local leadership. The result? A Cold War of intentions, one that was never openly declared but fiercely felt. So when Charles awarded the Royal Victorian chain to Sophie in an unpublicized and intimate gesture, it wasn't just a moment of gratitude. It was, to many in Camilla's inner circle, a symbolic reshuffling of favor. The optics were impossible to ignore. At a time when Camilla was reportedly struggling with internal loyalty concerns and an increasingly scrutinized public image, Sophie's rise appeared effortless and genuine. Royal aides could not miss the stark contrast. Camilla's influence was being increasingly managed, while Sophie's was expanding without resistance. Even more telling was the Queen Consort's absence from the ceremony. There was no official explanation, no scheduling conflict announced, just silence. And in the world of royal diplomacy, silence often speaks volumes. Insiders now speculate the absence was intentional, a quiet protest against what some described as a calculated elevation of a rival figure. For Charles, the decision to honor Sophie may have come from a deeply personal place, but the impact has been undeniably political. He now finds himself at the center of an invisible tug-of-war. On one side, the Queen Consort, the woman who stood by him through scandal and transformation, whose courtly influence has helped reshape the monarchy's softer image. On the other, Sophie, the figure seen as carrying the Queen's legacy of discipline, dignity, and duty. A monarch cannot afford division between his two most powerful female allies. Yet in rewarding one, he may have quietly alienated the other. Palace staff describe a subtle realignment inside Camilla's circle. Some long-trusted companions are reportedly reconsidering their positions, while others are said to be feeling a chill in the Queen's tone when Sophie's name arises. Behind the scenes, events are no longer just ceremonial, they're strategic. Every appearance, every appointment, every absence has become a move on the royal chessboard. And while the public sees smiles and medals, those closest to the throne sense a deeper, more volatile current shifting underfoot. And yet, even as tension brewed between royal women, a more haunting influence was quietly being revealed, one that began with Queen Elizabeth herself. In a sealed letter delivered to King Charles weeks after his accession, Queen Elizabeth left behind one final wish, one that had nothing to do with politics or power. It was about Sophie, and it's only now, with the royal Victorian chain in Sophie's hands, that its full meaning has come to light. For years, the late Queen had quietly drafted a collection of personal letters, private reflections, and final instructions intended for her children and closest confidants. These were not state documents or constitutional advisories, but deeply personal notes, handwritten and sealed with the Queen's own wax insignia. When Charles opened the letter addressed to him shortly after the funeral rites concluded, those in the room said the new king's hands trembled. It wasn't a briefing on succession. It wasn't about protocol. It was a confession, a recognition of the woman who had stood in the shadows and kept the crown from crumbling. In that quiet letter, Elizabeth wrote plainly of her admiration for Sophie. She described her as unshakable, gracious in silence, and stronger than many realized. The Queen made no elaborate demands, only a heartfelt appeal that Charles see Sophie as I have seen her, and that he not allow such devotion to fade unrecognized. The words hit Charles deeply, not just because of their warmth, but because they came from a sovereign known for restraint. Elizabeth rarely indulged sentiment. So when she wrote, Sophie steadied the monarchy when others wavered. It wasn't just praise, it was a directive. That letter, according to royal aides, shifted everything. It gave Charles the emotional and moral clarity he needed to act. The royal Victorian chain, an honor bestowed at the monarch's sole discretion, was chosen as the vehicle not just because of its significance, but because it allowed the gesture to remain personal, untainted by politics. The timing was no coincidence. Insiders say Charles had planned to honor Sophie publicly during the coronation season, but after reading his mother's letter, he chose a more intimate and deliberate path. The honor had to be given not as a spectacle, but as a legacy fulfilled. Those close to the king say he read the letter repeatedly in the days leading to the ceremony. One aide recalled him murmuring the phrase, "She steadied the monarchy," under his breath during a briefing. He knew what had to be done, and he knew he couldn't delay. The Queen's death had fractured the family in more ways than one. Trust was strained, roles were uncertain, and within that chaos, Sophie had remained a silent pillar. Elizabeth had seen it. Now it was Charles's turn to acknowledge it. And so, when the royal Victorian chain was finally placed around Sophie's neck, it wasn't just a royal command fulfilled, it was a final message from a mother to her son, from a monarch to her successor. Elizabeth had orchestrated one last moment from beyond the grave, and in doing so, she had drawn a quiet but permanent line in the history of the crown, linking Sophie to her reign not as an accessory, but as an inheritor of its steadiness. But this elevation was not just symbolic, it had immediate consequences within the inner circle, especially among those once loyal to Prince Andrew. Sophie's rise hasn't gone unnoticed, and certainly not by the York branch. With Prince Andrew increasingly isolated and his daughters struggling to retain royal relevance, the sudden spotlight on Sophie has stirred whispers of resentment, rivalry, and strategic countermoves behind palace walls. Once a dominant force in royal circles, the York family now finds itself shrinking in both visibility and influence. Prince Andrew's public fall from grace has cast a long shadow over Beatrice and Eugenie, who despite personal popularity have struggled to regain their standing. As invitations dwindled and responsibilities slipped away, there was quiet hope within the York household that Charles would extend an olive branch, particularly to Beatrice, whose recent public engagements hinted at readiness for a more formal role. But that hope was shattered the moment Sophie emerged from Windsor, with the royal Victorian chain, the very honor that some insiders believed Beatrice had quietly anticipated. The optics couldn't be ignored. While Sophie was embraced as a pillar of royal duty, the York sisters watched from the sidelines. Behind closed doors, courtiers confirmed what the public could only speculate. Beatrice had been floated for a ceremonial position during the new king's restructuring phase. But it never materialized. Not because she lacked merit, but because trust already thin after Andrew's controversies had evaporated. In contrast, Sophie represented stability. And when measured beside decades of scandal and friction, her elevation felt less like a reward and more like a declaration of succession in influence. Andrew, once considered a central player in the Queen's inner ring, now walks the palace halls as a ghost of his former role. The tension between him and Charles is no longer concealed. It's coded into protocol changes, seating charts and silence. But now that Sophie and Edward are ascending quietly, diplomatically, and with the monarch's favour, the York camp sees something far more threatening than exclusion. They see replacement. And that realization has prompted subtle retaliation. Sources within royal administration describe quiet discomfort in private meetings, with veiled remarks and unexpected resistance to Sophie's growing participation in high-level planning. While Beatrice and Eugenie remain outwardly loyal to the crown, their inner circle has become increasingly wary of the Wessex resurgence. Reports suggest that Eugenie, though less politically engaged, has expressed concern over her children's place in future royal structures. Beatrice, by contrast, has grown more assertive, allegedly requesting direct communication with Charles regarding future roles, only to be met with delayed responses or diplomatic diversions. To many, it feels like a slow but deliberate phasing out of York influence in favour of a new inner court, one where Sophie and Edward stand not just as senior royals, but as future architects of continuity. The bitterness is not always spoken aloud, but it hangs in the air during family engagements. Glances unreturned, conversations cut short. An invisible hierarchy now governs even the most ceremonial of gatherings. And at the centre of it all stands Sophie, no longer the silent Duchess, but the unspoken successor to the Queen's legacy of discretion and command. The very honour that raised her above expectation has now drawn her into the fiercest undercurrent of palace rivalry. Yet as factions shifted and rivalries deepened, it was one gesture, small in public, enormous in meaning, that solidified Sophie's place beyond doubt. In a moment, unscripted and raw, the Princess of Wales stepped forward. No speech, no protocol, just an embrace that said everything the crown could not. To those watching closely, it was a passing of torch, a united front, and a subtle warning to those still clinging to old hierarchies. It wasn't planned, it wasn't rehearsed, but it changed everything. As the ceremony reached its quiet peak, Catherine, who had remained in the background for much of the formalities, crossed the room and embraced Sophie in front of a stunned inner circle. There were no cameras, no applause, only a silence that cracked open decades of royal restraint. It was an act the monarchy rarely permits, and yet, in that one moment, Catherine made it clear, Sophie's rise wasn't just endorsed by the king, it was blessed by the future queen herself. What made the moment all the more striking was the weight of history behind their bond. Years ago, their relationship had been marked by distance, polite but reserved. They had come into the royal fold through different doors at different times under vastly different pressures. But time and tribulation had transformed that distance into deep trust. While others flailed under the spotlight or exploited it for their own ambitions, Sophie and Catherine had grown closer, bound by shared burdens, silent sacrifices, and an unwavering belief in the monarchy's survival through dignity, not spectacle. Their values aligned with uncanny precision. Both understood the need to protect the crown without making themselves the story. Both shielded their children, guarded their marriages, and defended the institution even as it strained under public scrutiny. And both knew that the monarchy's future wouldn't be shaped by pageantry, but by the quiet force of women who refused to be sidelined. That embrace wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. It signaled a realignment within the royal structure, where legacy was being passed through shared resolve, rather than titles alone. Royal watchers, many of whom were caught off guard by the unfiltered humanity of the gesture, later described it as a pivotal royal moment, not because of what was said, but because of what it disrupted. No longer was Sophie the quiet figure behind Edward. No longer was Catherine the isolated figure beside William. Together they presented a new axis of power, modern, unshakable, and bound by a loyalty that didn't need to be spoken. The monarchy's male heirs may lead by blood, but in that moment, its heartbeat was distinctly feminine. It was also a message to those still loyal to fading factions, to those clinging to old titles and archaic privileges. The gesture was unmistakable. The women now held the crown's conscience, and in doing so, they would not tolerate disunity masked as tradition. The embrace became a dividing line in the royal sand, marking not just an alliance, but a warning. But while allies gathered around her, Sophie's new honor came with responsibilities and secrets few were prepared for. Buried in the insignia of the royal Victorian chain lies a centuries-old cipher, one only revealed to those deemed protectors of the monarchy's moral compass. Sources suggest Sophie was granted access to a document long believed lost, Legacy Clarion. But what exactly is it, and why now? For decades, Legacy Clarion was dismissed as myth, an old royal legend passed quietly between historians and palace archivists. Said to be a handwritten manuscript originating from Queen Victoria's era, it reportedly outlined the guiding principles for moral sovereignty, succession ethics, and the sacred covenant between the monarchy and its people. Not a legal document, but a moral compass unratified by Parliament yet sacred within the royal vaults. Sealed away, protected by a singular code embedded only within one of the highest honours of the crown, the royal Victorian chain. And when Sophie received it, insiders say she was not just awarded a medal, she was entrusted with a secret. Within days of the private ceremony at Windsor, quiet movements stirred in the deepest corners of the royal archives. Staff typically assigned to ceremonial duties were reassigned. Old keys were requested. Security protocols were temporarily escalated around the Queen's gallery. Those familiar with the palace's inner workings understood what these signs meant. Someone had been granted archival clearance, and not just to historical collections, but to the Crown's most restricted level of internal documentation. It was Sophie. And the timing was no accident. Senior aides confirm that Charles, following the instructions left behind by Elizabeth and guided by his own conscience, authorized Sophie's access to a sealed vault beneath the Round Tower, a place rumored to house not only Legacy Clarion, but other unpublished charters, succession contingency papers, and early drafts of moral codes authored by Queen Mary, George VI, and Elizabeth herself. These weren't public records, they were the Crown's conscience in ink, and with them came an invisible burden few had ever carried. One passage, reportedly included in Legacy Clarion, discusses the moral right of the sovereign to delegate ethical oversight to a non-heir, a steward of balance, whose duty is not to rule, but to preserve integrity. Sophie, according to palace sources, was chosen to be that steward. Her role would not be performative, it would be powerful. She was to review succession guidance in light of changing public sentiment, advise on the ethical alignment of royal charities, and even contribute to decisions regarding the future of lesser royal titles. Her voice, though not political, would carry immense moral authority behind palace gates. And with this came the most profound symbolism of all, the passing of guardianship from one queen to another, not by blood, but by trust. Elizabeth had wielded this unseen power quietly. Now, in her absence, she had guided its transfer to Sophie. It wasn't a throne, it was a compass. And in a royal family facing generational tension, constitutional uncertainty, and growing public skepticism, that compass might soon become more critical than the crown itself. And as palace walls echoed with new purpose, Charles made one final move that sealed Sophie's place in royal history, an appointment few expected. In a last-minute adjustment to the royal roster, King Charles did more than honor Sophie, he empowered her. Her new title wasn't just ceremonial, it was strategic. Effective immediately, Sophie would assume unprecedented authority in royal affairs. And the implications? Monumental. The announcement did not arrive with trumpets or public ceremony. Instead, it moved through the palace like a controlled shockwave, quiet, swift, irreversible. Charles had signed a private directive naming Sophie as the royal representative to the Order of Legacy, a position that did not exist in any modern handbook of titles. It was created for her, designed around her, built from the quiet trust she had earned over decades of unbroken service. Within hours, senior staff realized this role carried more than symbolism. It carried access, influence, weight. For the first time, Sophie was formally granted authority to advise on inter-Commonwealth appointments and royal patronage decisions that shape not just charity, but loyalty, diplomacy, and soft power across continents. This was not about cutting ribbons. This was about shaping the future voice of the crown across borders, once guided solely by the late Queen herself. In one decisive move, Charles placed Sophie at the crossroads of legacy and reform, giving her jurisdiction over the delicate transition of royal influence in a post-Elizabeth era. Even more quietly, another responsibility was folded into her mandate, overseeing historical legacy transitions. The archives, the dormant patronages, the unfinished obligations left behind when Elizabeth's reign ended. These were not ceremonial leftovers, they were living promises. And now Sophie was their guardian. For palace staff who had spent careers navigating rigid hierarchy, the breadth of power granted to someone once viewed as a background figure was staggering. Doors that had never opened to anyone outside the direct line of succession now opened for her. Inside royal administration, the reaction was electric. Shock rippled through departments that had long answered only to the monarch or his heir. Advisors whispered that this was not an expansion of duty, it was a redistribution of gravity. Power was being redirected, rebalanced, and with it the internal order of the monarchy was quietly being rewritten. But beneath the politics, something more intimate was unfolding. With this position came an unspoken expectation. Sophie would now mentor the next generation of royal women. Not as a figurehead, but as a guide through the brutal labyrinth of duty, survival, and invisible power. Catherine, Charlotte, one day. Even future outsiders who would step into the monarchy's unforgiving glare. Sophie would be their anchor in the storm, just as Elizabeth had once been for her. Palace insiders now refer to this moment as the true reconfiguration of the monarchy, not because a crown changed hands, but because its moral center shifted. Quietly, permanently, from a sovereign who ruled for 70 years, to a woman who had never sought the spotlight but now stood at the axis of the crown's most sensitive future. The rise had not been loud, it had not been demanded, it had been earned. Through years of silence, through loyalty without reward, through strength without applause. And now, at the culmination of everything she had endured, Sophie stood transformed not by spectacle, but by trust. As the world watched the coronation of status and secrecy collide, one thing became clear. Duchess Sophie is no longer in the shadows, she's at the heart of the crown's most guarded future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.